All right, in this last video, we're going to look at object introspection. And really, we've been doing that for quite a while now, right from the beginning of this session of videos. When we looked at DIR, it showed us the attributes. That's a way that we can introspect or use introspection on an object, which is simply the ability of an object to tell us about itself or show its contents or its underpinnings. So we used dir and dict, and we also used vars to do this, right? We used dir, we used dict or vars, and we were able to see attributes from each of those. Now I'd like to show a few more other elements of introspection. One would be of bases. Let's begin by, let's say, inheriting from list. We'll just do that where we're going to inherit from the list class. We could, of course, put in another class. Maybe we should do that. Let's make a what class, or I'll call this parent, and we'll say class parent. And we'll say, I'm just going to say pass just to make an empty class. And what I'd like to do is look at a special attribute called bases. This is the first attribute of introspection that we'll look at. Bases shows us a tuple of the classes from which this class inherits. And in fact, it gives us the class object. I believe we could actually look at that first class object and see what its attributes are. Let's say, let's give it to p equals 100. And let's see, if I look at the first item in that tuple of inheritance, and I get, wait, that's not happening. Oh, it's because it's from print. That's not what I wanted. I want to print from bases, which is a tuple of classes from which we inherit. We see the parent class. This is actually the parent class. I could say .p and see 100. Now stare at that for a while. Let's break it down. Bases gave us a tuple that looks like this. That's a tuple with one item in it. The first item, of course, is class parent. And when we look at .p of class parent, we see 100 because that's an attribute of it. So what bases does for us is it shows us a tuple of the actual class objects from which this class inherits. That means that we could track it all the way up to see what it inherits from. Let's say we inherit from two things, parent and list class. And you see we've got two items in the tuple now, the class parent and the class list. Now, of course, we could have parent inherit from list. This will make it part of the inheritance lookup, where if we're looking for something in do, it might look for it in parent and then look for it in list. But when we look at the bases, we'll see that bases only shows us the immediate inheriting class. We could then go to parent and say, show me the bases of that object or that class, and that would show us list. And then we could ask maybe for, let's print list.bases or bases. It should show us what list inherits from. What does list inherit from? Oh, it inherits from object. And so this would also be the case that if we got rid of any inheritance altogether and we just had do again, and we looked at the bases of do, what do you suppose do inherits from? Well, we've said it. It inherits from object. Because any class that doesn't explicitly inherit from a class inherits from object, as we've said before. Now, there are two other things I'd like to show you. Well, there's a couple of other things. One I think we touched on earlier, and that is that there's built-in documentation for all classes and methods. And so the class has access to, or we have access to, the documentation using the doc attribute. This attribute, which will also show up when we do help, shows us the value of that string. Let's print do.dothis.doc. Maybe you're starting to get a sense that we have the chance and the possibility of accessing really any part of the structure of any kind of set of classes and methods that are part of an inheritance tree or part of any class. We can easily take a look at all the parts of any of the attributes of any object that we're working with, particularly of classes. There are two last pieces of this that I'd like to show you. As we said before, there are a couple of ways to look at the attributes of a given object. We can use dir. We can use vars. We can use .dict, and these all work slightly differently, but they all get at the same idea. The last is something called inspect, and it's something I'd like to show you here. We looked at the doc attribute. It's called inspect, and I'd like to show it to you. Let's take a look at and compare, as it's suggesting here, the dir of do, and here I'll label it properly. We'll look at the inspect get members of do and see what that tells us. I'm going to ask you, as part of the homework, to inspect a class and see what members it has. Let's compare these two and see what it gives us. Well, for dir, we're seeing all the attributes that are available to, or the names of the attributes that are available to the class, and we've said that before. In particular, we see D and do this. D and do this are attributes of the class. When we look at inspect get members, we're looking at a list of tuples. Now, this isn't a dictionary. This is a list of tuples. And it also has all of the names of the attributes that are available to this object. But the second item in each of these tuples is the actual object that it points to. So, for example, do this is a method. Let's look at the very end here. There's do this, or here's D, for example. D is a class attribute that's associated or points to an integer 5, and that's what's in the tuple. And the same thing is true with do this. Do this and the function associated with it. Now, actually, I want to compare this to vars because I believe vars does something very similar. The only difference is that vars will only show you those attributes that belong to the object itself, or to the in this case, the class itself. And get members will show you everything that is available to the class. But let's compare these two, and I want to see what comes out at the end, as long as we don't make an error. Print, we need a third one. Okay, good. Okay, we get back a dictionary, and this is kind of interesting because here we have D and 5, and do this and function do this. Let's compare it to what we had up here. Do this and function do this. Okay, so vars and inspect get members are really very similar. in that they will show you a tuple of all of the attributes, or a dictionary pair of all of the attributes that belong, that are available. No, I'm sorry. This is the difference between them. Both of them will show you the name of the attribute and the object associated with it, and it will give you access to those. You can see in both of these we have access to the function do this, which we could even call through this approach. But the difference between vars and getMembers is that getMembers gets you the complete list of attributes that are available to this class, and vars only gives you those attributes that are part of the class. So which one to use, I guess, will be up to you. But what I'm going to ask you to use is getMembers. Now, the very last thing that I'd like to show you is a function called Callable. And I guess what I'll do is I'll use Callable just on the attributes as they're written. I will go ahead, or as the way they're normally accessed. I will print Callable, let's say Callable of len. Let's try that. Let's see what we get. All right, len is true. Len is callable. Let's do Callable of 5. Can you call 5? Callable cannot be called. Okay, very interesting. Callable cannot be called. All right, so that should mean that we can find out whether an attribute of do, like do this, is callable. Is do this callable? Let's see. Yes, do this is callable, and that makes sense because you can call a method. So Callable is going to be able to tell us whether or not a function is callable. And the reason I mention this is that there is another part of getMembers that's really, really exciting. And what I'm going to ask you to do in the homework is find the arguments that are part of a particular function. I'm going to ask you to inspect that function and find out whether there's a particular, whether you can get the signature, the argument signature of a function. Let's use inspect.signature to find this out. Here you can see that I have correctly identified that do this is callable. Now that I know this, let's find out the argument signature of do this. I'm going to print inspect.signature do this, or do this. And that's going to show me the argument signature. Now let's make do this a little more elaborate. Let's say that we have a parameter called P, a parameter called BB, and another parameter with a keyword argument. And let's look at the signature now. Oh, interesting. So it actually shows us the entire signature. Is that a string or a tuple? What is that? Let's print the type of it. Oh, it's a special object called a signature object. And I'm sure that if we were to take a look at the vars for inspect signature object, we would be able to see, hopefully, some other ways that we can use the signature object to learn more about the object that we're working with. Oh, interesting. So the signature object actually isn't inspectable this way. That's really interesting. Really interesting. I don't know what it would get us if we do the dir, but we could try it. Okay, looks like some attributes here that are kind of interesting. From built-in parameters, I'm not sure what parameters will get us, but I am curious. So I'm going to try that. Anyway, the lesson here is that even though there's, quite a lot that we've already learned, there's even more about inspecting objects that we could learn. And what I want you to understand about this, oh, interesting, parameters. I don't know. Let's see what the dir of parameter. No, I'd like to see what parameters is. Oops. Interesting. Ha. It looks like parameters is an ordered dict, which is a special kind of dictionary that tells all of the parameters of the function, and then has a parameter object associated with it. So we'd like to go further with this, but this is probably getting about as deep as we'd like. Here's the thing. Even in those last couple of minutes, I demonstrated to you that it's possible to use these different tools that we have to see what's inside. That's what we call introspection. Introspection allows us to look at any aspect of what object we're working with, find out what's made up of it, and we may find ourselves getting deeper and deeper and deeper into objects that are related to other objects that make up a very complex structure. In this particular case, we looked at the signature of a function, and then we saw that that's a special object that we can further inspect. And so it can be really fascinating to explore Python in this way. Mostly what I want us to understand is that we have this ability and that we have some basic tools to get started. It means that we can learn more and more about Python without even looking at documentation, which can sometimes be a very helpful way to work through what we're dealing with when we're dealing with a new part of Python, a built-in Python, or even a module that we've installed and are now using. So I hope you'll use this for good and not for evil, and that you'll use it in good health.